In the story we know, Dexter Morgan performed his final, desperate act of self. He steered his boat into the heart of a hurricane, a sacrificial offering to the gods of chaos. He left behind a city of ghosts, a butchered lover in a bathtub, a brother molded into a monster, a wife bleeding out on a table, and a sister, his one tethered to humanity, buried in a pine box. The storm took him. The lumberjack's life was his penance, a silent, numb purgatory for a man who had become a ghost in his own skin. But that was the escape. Tonight, we pry open a rusted-shut door in time. We step into the world where the storm missed him, where the wave of destruction he spent a decade building didn't crest and break, but turned into a riptide, pulling him back to shore. This is the world where Dexter Morgan never vanished. He didn't get to run. He didn't get to hide. He had to stand in the ruin of his own making and face the one thing the dark passenger never prepared him for. Not capture, not death, but the relentless, searing light of consequence. This is not the story of a monster's quiet end. This is the story of his true unraveling. The story where every lie was a thread pulled, every corpse a witness that wouldn't stay buried. This is the endgame he was never smart enough to foresee. Let's dive into the timeline where Dexter Morgan stayed and witness the world he forged in blood finally come to collect its debt. Every choice has a price. Dexter Morgan's entire life was a masterclass in deferring that payment. He built his existence on a foundation of controlled chaos, always the architect, never the casualty. When the bill came due, his only reflex was to run, to burn it all down and vanish into the anonymity of the storm. But in this reality, the escape route was closed. The storm passed him by, leaving him stranded in the wreckage, and the highest cost of all had just been tallied. Debra Morgan. She did not die as a Jane Doe in a cold storage unit. Her death is secret, buried with her brother. Here, she died in the blinding, fluorescent light of a hospital ICU. Her last breaths were not witnessed by a lone, grieving executioner, but by a gallery of heartbroken guardians. Quinn, his face a mask of fury and grief. Batista, weeping openly. Masuka uncharacteristically silent and still, and standing among them, the ghost at the funeral. Dexter, the last one seen at her bedside, the one whose fingers they would all soon recall, who had been on the controls of her life support. Sound of a police radio crackling softly, the squeak of a shoe on linoleum. This was a death that could not be silenced. The official report would call it a tragic complication from a gunshot wound. But in the hallways of Miami Metro, another report was being filed, one written in gut instinct and sidelong glances. In the timeline we know, his disappearance was an admission of guilt that ended the conversation. But here, his presence was a constant, nagging question. It kept the case open. It kept the eyes on him. It began not with an accusation, but with a silence. The easy camaraderie in the break room would fracture when he entered. The "Good morning, Dexter" from Angel was now strained, his eyes searching Dexter's for a shadow he could no longer ignore. Quinn's old suspicions, once buried under a mountain of professional respect and a closed investigation, were now exuding. He hadn't just lost the woman he loved. He saw the man he always distrusted standing over her grave. He started reopening cold cases, not with the frenzy of a cop, but with the cold determination of a hunter. Even Mas, usually lost in a world of gallows humor and forensic minutiae, would fall quiet, remembering a stray comment from Debra, a strange reaction from Dexter to a particular crime scene. The dots weren't just being connected, they were forming a picture everyone had been willfully blind to for a decade. The donuts he brought now sat uneaten. The coffee he poured grew cold. Dexter Morgan was no longer the friendly, awkward blood spatter analyst. He had become a crime scene himself, one his friends and colleagues were just beginning to process. And the first rule of police work is that you never ever contaminate the scene. How many clues do you miss when you trust someone? For years, Dexter Morgan was not just a colleague, he was a fixture. The quiet, reliable genius who solved their puzzles while hiding a far darker one in plain sight. But trust is a lens that obscures the truth, and once it cracks, every distorted detail snaps into a terrifying, brutal focus. The fracture began with Debra's death, and in its wake, the ghosts of a decade past began to stir, whispering from forgotten evidence lockers and sealed case files. It started not with a bang, but with a slow, sickening dread, as Angel Batista, burdened by the weight of his dual grief for Lagerta and now Debra, found himself alone one night in his office, staring at a storage box he'd sworn never to open. Inside were Maria Lagerta's final, desperate notes on the Bay Harbor butcher case, notes he had once dismissed as the obsession of a wounded careerist. Rereading them now, her words were no longer paranoid conjecture, but a prophetic blueprint. She wasn't wrong. She was murdered for being right. Across the precinct, Quinn, fueled by a grief that had curdled into a cold, singular rage, began pulling the thread of every loose end he'd ever forced himself to ignore. He revisited the chaotic blood patterns at crime scenes Dexter had clarified, re-interviewed witnesses who described a quiet, intense man who didn't quite fit, and saw, with horrifying clarity, how the butcher's kills perfectly aligned with Dexter's absences. Even Masuka, connecting a stray fiber from a past case to a brand of fishing wire Dexter once casually mentioned, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morgue. The dam didn't break, it dissolved. piece by piece, until every single thread the reopened Butcher case, Debra's tormented therapy sessions, Lagerta's notes, Quinn's suspicions converged into an inescapable web, all pointing back to one man. And this time, there was no storm to vanish into, no frontier to hide behind. The dark passenger, and the man who carried it, was cornered in the one place he thought he was safest, the precinct he had called home. Chapter 3: The killer with no trade place left to hide. Narrator: a predator without shadows becomes prey. For Dexter Morgan, the carefully constructed world was not just crumbling at the edges, it was collapsing in on him, and the very instincts that had kept him alive for decades began to turn against him. The cool, analytical calculus of the dark passenger was being overridden by a far more primal and far more dangerous signal: raw human panic. Every glance from a colleague was a potential accusation, every ring of his desk phone a death knell. He was a spider feeling the tremors on every strand of his web, and in his desperation he began to tear it apart himself. The meticulous rituals that once defined his kill stalking, the confirmation, the bloodslide collection were abandoned in a frantic scramble to eliminate loose ends. He killed not with the cold satisfaction of a righteous executioner, but with the ragged breath of a cornered animal. Silencing a potential witness here, disposing of a sudden threat there. The code of Harry, the sacred text that had been his moral compass and psychological shield, shattered into useless dogma. It was a code for a hunter who controlled the game, not for a fugitive fighting for his next breath. In this frantic, bloody unraveling, Dexter was forced to confront the horrifying truth he had spent a lifetime denying. Stripped of his rules, he was not a noble monster, he was just a monster. The city of Miami, once his boundless neon-drenched hunting ground where he moved like a shark through dark waters, transformed into a suffocating cage of his own making. Every streetlight a searchlight, and every familiar face a potential judge. Chapter 4: The Master Downfall. Dexter gets outsmarted. Narrator: for years, Dexter Morgan hunted predators who slipped through the cracks of a fractured system. He was the unseen variable, the one who exploited the gaps in procedure and the limits of human perception. But the moment he became the prey, the very foundation of his safety shattered. The cracks closed around him, sealed by the one force he had chronically underestimated: the collective resolve of the people he called his colleagues. His greatest threat was not a more cunning serial killer, it was Miami Metro homicide, finally working in concert. A machine whose gears, once gummed by his presence, were now meshing perfectly to grind him down. The irony was exquisite. The system he had manipulated for over a decade was now turning its full, unblinking gaze upon him. Quinn, his grief a cold, hard diamond of obsession, refused to let Debra's death be filed away, becoming a relentless force of pressure from within the squad room. Batista, armed with the grim certainty of Lagerta's notes, provided the official weight and political will to reopen cases long thought closed. His pursuit no longer just professional, but deeply personal. Masuka, in his element of pure forensics, began reanalyzing old blood evidence with a fresh, suspicious eye, finding unnatural spatter patterns and trace evidence that pointed not to a crime of passion, but to a deliberate, theatrical staging. And when the scope of the suspicion widened to the legend of the Bay Harbor Butcher, the FBI was called in, bringing a level of digital and psychological profiling that made Miami Metro's methods look quaint. They weren't looking for a monster in the shadows, they were building a cage of cold, hard data around the man in the break room. Piece by piece, the lie of Dexter Morgan was unraveled not by a villain, but by the very concept of justice, slow, methodical, and collective, that he had always believed he served alone. For the first time in his life, the master of the game was completely outmatched, checkmated by the board itself. Chapter 5: The Arrest That Breaks the Legend. **** Narrator: every story eventually reaches the scene where the mask falls, not with a bang, but with a whisper. In this timeline, Dexter Morgan's legend does not end in a blaze of gunfire or a dramatic escape. It ends in the profound, crushing silence of the place he once called home. His arrest is not a raid. It is a quiet, administrative severance. Angel Batista and a stone-faced Quinn meet him not in a dark alley, but in the bright, sterile fluorescence of the Miami Metro bullpen, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 shared case files and coffee breaks. There are no drawn guns, no struggle. The simple, devastating command: Dexter Morgan, you're under arrest, hangs in the air, and the procedural machinery he once navigated so expertly now grinds into motion against him. The officers can barely look him in the eye, not out of fear of the Bay Harbor Butcher, but out of shame for the friend they never truly knew. His mugshot, stripped of the lab coat and the awkward smile, becomes the definitive, haunting portrait of the monster Miami both feared and fostered. The city is torn as his story explodes into the public consciousness. Some decry him as a psychopath who hid behind a badge and a warped moral code, while others, disillusioned with a broken system, controversially label him a dark hero. Yet a smaller, more somber group sees him as a tragic inevitability, a symptom of a justice system so flawed it created its own monstrous mirror-image counterpart. And as the cameras descend and the world watches, his trial becomes more than a media circus. It becomes a referendum on justice itself, with a man who once passed judgment from the shadows now forced to sit, silent and exposed, in the blinding light of it. Chapter 6: The Trial of the Century. Narrator. Everyone thought they knew Dexter Morgan, the brilliant analyst, the devoted brother, the awkward friend. But the man who sat in the courtroom was a stranger, even to himself. This was the ultimate judgment, a stage far more terrifying than any kill room. Harry's ghost was silent. The code was a shredded piece of paper in evidence. Here, there were no dark passengers, only the cold, hard light of the law. The prosecution methodically dismantled the legend, projecting kill room photos onto screens for a gasping public, presenting his bloodslide collection not as a rogues gallery of justice, but as the morbid trophies of a narcissist. The pattern of victims, their crimes, their connections, their proximity to his life was laid out in an undeniable mosaic of premeditation. And as the mountain of evidence grew, Dexter's internal justifications crumbled. The noble purpose, the moral armor he had clung to for survival, melted away under the heat of scrutiny, leaving only the ugly, naked truth. He didn't kill solely out of a twisted sense of duty. He killed because he wanted to. He needed to. The thrill, the control, the dark, shimmering release, it was his addiction, and the code was merely his enabling narrative. This final, horrifying self-awareness was a poison, but it was nothing compared to the moment the prosecution called Harrison to the stand. Seeing his son, a living embodiment of all the damage he had wrought, forced to articulate the absences, the lies, the chilling coldness, was the final, brutal hammer blow. The carefully constructed mask didn't just slip, it exploded into a million pieces, and for the first time, the world saw the raw, unfiltered wreckage of the man beneath. The jury did not take long. They weren't just convicting a serial killer. They were rejecting a lie that a city had told itself for a decade. In this alternate universe, the story of Dexter Morgan does not conclude with a single, definitive fate, but spirals into one of two dark, poetically just conclusions, each a perfect mirror to the life he led. In ending A, the state of Florida, in a move of unprecedented political and public will, restores the death penalty specifically for his case. His end is not in a storm of his own making, but in the sterile, brightly lit execution chamber he once analyzed from a professional distance. He dies by lethal injection, a quiet, clinical, and state-sanctioned procedure that mirrors the cold, dispassionate efficiency of his own table. There is no struggle, no last-minute escape. As the chemicals flood his veins, his final words are not a confession of guilt, but a whispered admission of powerlessness to the one jury that ever truly mattered, himself. I tried to stop it. I never could in this moment. The last vestige of his constructed self dissolves, and the dark passenger, starved of its host, ceases to exist. In ending B, he cheats the needle, only to be delivered into a far more intimate hell. He is sentenced to life in a maximum security prison, becoming a permanent exhibit in the zoo he once curated. Here, the hunter is forever trapped among his own kind. His end is not swift or clean. Perhaps a vengeful inmate, a brother or a son of one of his victims, shanks him in a crowded shower, making him just another statistic of prison violence. Or perhaps he is placed in permanent solitary confinement, a concrete and steel version of the emotional isolation he always claimed to feel, left to slowly rot in a silence where the only voice left is the one in his own head. The irony is perfect and inescapable. Dexter Morgan, the butcher of Bay Harbor, ultimately dies surrounded by the very monsters he used to hunt. His final sight, not the open ocean, but the faces of the evil he claimed to despise, reflected back at him in his final, fleeting moment. Dexter Morgan constructed his entire life around a single, the fragile lie that he could control the darkness. He built a fortress of forensic expertise, social mimicry, and a rigid moral code, believing these walls could contain the chaos within. But this timeline, the one without an escape, proves a more terrifying truth. The moment he stopped running, the moment the storm passed him by, the darkness did not simply remain, it overflowed. It seeped into his judgment, corrupted his rituals, and ultimately exposed him. In facing the consequences he spent a lifetime avoiding, he lost everything. The cherished illusion of the righteous vigilante was stripped away, revealing a man killing for survival and satisfaction. The mask of justice, carved for him by Harry, splintered under the weight of undeniable evidence. The protective cloak of anonymity, woven from donuts and awkward smiles, was torn aside by the betrayed gazes of his friends. And finally, he lost the one thing he valued above all else: control. His meticulous world was reduced to the chaos of a cornered animal. This harsh, unflinching reality reveals the most painful truth of all. Dexter didn't sail into that hurricane to escape the law, or Miami Metro, or even his grief. He faked his death to escape himself, to avoid the horrifying self-confrontation that this timeline forces upon him. If he had stayed, the world would not have seen a mythic anti-hero or a simplistic monster. They would have seen the man he truly was, laid bare in a courtroom under the glare of the lights. A profoundly broken man, a product of unimaginable trauma, who chose to feed his compulsions rather than conquer them. Not a hero, not a monster, just a man, finally and utterly unable to outrun the blood on his hands because it was never on the outside. It was the very river that ran through him.